The following PowerPoints and video is for the living world. It is chapter 5 in your Princeton review book. Make sure you printed out the objectives so that you can answer the questions as we go along. A little bit out of order here, but we're just going to go through these definitions under number 1. I wanted to put these two together because they're related. So we're going to start with biodiversity. And you can go ahead and pause it so you can write down the information, or you can write it down as you're listening. But biodiversity is the variation among organisms. And it includes the species richness, the genetic diversity, and the ecosystem diversity. And for biodiversity, we have said all year long that an ecosystem that has the highest biodiversity on Earth would be the coral reefs. And if we had to name a terrestrial ecosystem, meaning on land, then that would be our tropical rainforest. So you can think about the characteristics of both of these. They have many different species, many different organisms, lots of life. Genetically, there's a great variation. And then ecosystem diversity is just the interactions between organisms and their ecosystems. So there's lots of different interactions here. So biodiversity includes all of these. For species richness, it's just the number of different species in an area. So a great number of species for a biome will have high species richness. Our next one is the ecological niche. I've always stressed that the niche is not just the habitat, but it's the role of the organism. So the niche is everything that the organism does. So everything from where they live, their pattern of activity, what they eat, their role as far as if they're a consumer, like a primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Are they an apex predator? What are their defense mechanisms? So everything about an organism, it's all encompassing, is its ecological niche. So the definition on the screen, an ecological niche describes the functional position of an organism in its environment. We also talked about how through evolution, we don't have niches that completely overlap. So when we talk about the fundamental niche and the realized niche, we said that the fundamental niche is the niche that an organism should occupy. So we talked about the green and the brown anole, and we said, for example, that the fundamental niche of the green anole is all of South Florida, but the realized niche, actually where it's located, has been shrunk because it's been outcompeted by the brown anole, and so now the realized niche is located in the Everglades or other areas. So we've talked about the overlapping of niches, and over time, organisms are going to, if they're completely overlapping, then they're either going to die out or they're going to slowly change their niche so that they can both coexist. Your types of symbiotic relationships here, super duper easy. I hope that this is not even something that you have to think about or even watch this video for. Mutualism, commensalism, parasitism. Usually you guys are really good with mutualism and parasitism. Maybe commensalism, you have to be reminded a little bit, but mutualism, both organisms are going to benefit here. We said an example of that was mycorrhizae and the trees and the plants, and I showed you a picture, if you think back, of a tree that had mycorrhizal associations in the root system, and how the tree was flourishing and it was growing really big, and then without the mycorrhizae. And the reason why it's mutualistic is because mycorrhizae are composed of fungi, and so the mycorrhizae give the plant minerals and nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, so it helps to have the plant uptake more of those minerals and nutrients, and then the plant provides the fungus with the sugar and glucose or food. So they both help each other out, and they both help each other survive. Commensalism, this is the one that maybe you kind of forget, is when one organism benefits and the other one is unharmed. I gave you a couple of examples for this. I'm pretty sure I showed you epiphytes and a tree, and basically epiphytes, they grow up the side of a tree, and the whole idea here is that they don't draw nutrients from the tree, but they are benefiting because they're getting sunlight so that they can photosynthesize. I've also told you about army ants and silverfish. So they have a commensalistic relationship in that the army ants, they carry food long distances to the queen ant, and the silverfish, they follow the ants. And so as the ants drop food on the way, then the silverfish will eat them. So the silverfish are benefiting and the ants are unharmed. And parasitism is when one benefits and the other one is harmed. So this is an easy one. We could talk about so many different things. A tapeworm, for example, which you get from undercooked meat, lives in our intestines. And it is drawing nutrients from us, and so over time we're not getting the nutrients that we need, so they're benefiting because they're growing, or it's growing, and we're getting harmed because we're not getting the nutrients to absorb through our stomach. A tick in a dog is always a good example. So a tick is going to suck the blood from a dog, and then the dog is going to be harmed. Ticks spread disease and maybe are itchy or a nuisance to the dog. So these are the different types of symbiotic relationships. Keystone species. This is, we talked about this in the beginning of the year and throughout the year, but a species that has a disproportionately large effect on an environment relative to abundance. Basically, without this animal or organism, could be a plant as well, but without it, there are going to be some imbalances in the food chain and the food web, and other organisms may not be able to survive without them. One of the main ones we talked about was the gray wolf. So we talked about that in the beginning of the year. And we said that when the gray wolf was exterminated from Yellowstone National Park in that northern part of the United States, that we saw an increase in the herbivores because the gray wolf preys on, say, deer and other types of herbivores. And so their numbers increased, the herbivores. And when that happened, they ate up all of the grass and all of the vegetation. And so therefore, animals that needed that vegetation as their food were dying off. So you can think of like rabbits and different other types of animals that are herbivores. And so they ended up dying off, and it also affected the insect population. So without the gray wolf, we saw a major imbalance in all of the ecosystem. Fig trees we talked about in tropical rainforests. Fig trees are really important because they grow year-round in the tropical rainforest, and all animals are able to feed on figs. So without them, we would also see a disruption in the food web. And then sea urchins, I gave you the example. They are going to, hold on one second here. Okay, sea otters, not sea urchins. I just caught that mistake. And sea otters are going to be the keystone species. And the reason why is because they prey on the sea urchins, and the sea urchins eat kelp voraciously. So kelp forests are basically algae, brown algae that grow in the Pacific Ocean. Lots of biodiversity there. And so what happens is that the sea urchins eat the kelp, and so they can remove these kelp forests at very quick rates, and so the sea otters are going to prey on the sea urchin. So without them, we could see a decline in biodiversity in the kelp forest. Okay, albedo, one of my favorite words. Don't forget that the albedo is the amount of light reflected off of a surface. And you really just need to know that if something is completely dark, or it's a dark color like the ocean, it is going to have a low albedo. And if something is perfectly white, or it's white like snow, it's going to have a high albedo. And what that means is that the amount of light reflected off a white surface is high, and the amount of light reflected off the ocean is low. So the ocean is going to absorb more of that radiant energy. And I think that's basically what you need to know. The definition, be able to identify if a surface has a high or a low albedo. All right, so for number 2, it says define each of the different zones of the ocean. So if you remember, we talked about this also in the beginning of the year. And this was a picture I showed you. And we really don't go into marine ecosystems too much. But you have to have a general idea of what's going on here. So you don't need to like really understand what's happening at each area, but you have to have an idea of what the areas are. So the first part A, says the intertidal zone. And this is this area right here. If you can see my mouse. And it's the area between high tide and low tide. So when you go to a beach, and I say this all the time, and like you put your chair in the like on the sands, if you have to get up and move it because the tide's coming in, that you are sitting in the intertidal zone. So it's the area between high and low tide, and it's basically on the shoreline. Then we have the pelagic environment. So the pelagic environment is actually the whole ocean. So you can see from high tide to high tide, all the way across the ocean. So of that pelagic environment, we have the Neritic province. And it's really the area from high tide out to the end of the continental shelf. And I always say I get neurotic in the Neritic province. So it's the place where you would go swimming, and place where you would go maybe boating. So it's right off to the end of the continental shelf. So that's the Neritic province. The Oceanic province is the end of the continental shelf to the next continental shelf. So it's the open part of the ocean. The euphotic zone, it's not listed here, but we talked about it when we talked about marine ecosystems. So the euphotic zone is just the top portion of the ocean, and it's basically where light can penetrate. So in the euphotic zone, you would find organisms that are photosynthetic. You can think of like phytoplankton and free-floating organisms on the top of the ocean. We have the abyssal zone, or we have the baffle zone as well, but it doesn't list here for the baffle zone. But you can see the baffle zone before I do the abyssal. It's basically 200 meters out, or the end of the continental shelf, down to 2,000 to 3,000 meters deep. So it's just that area. The abyssal zone, it's 4,000 to 6,000 meters deep. It's part of the benthic environment. And you can see that we have an abyssal plain here, so it flattens out. And then we have the hadal zone. The hadal zone is deeper than 6,000 meters, and very, very minimal life here. Low diversity, biodiversity. Obviously, there's no light penetration. It's the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. If you remember when we talked about chemosynthesis, this is where we're talking about chemosynthesis occurring. So we talked about the hydrothermal vents that are at the bottom of the ocean. And of these vents, we have sulfur that come out. And there are bacteria that live down there, that they're archaebacteria that are able to use that sulfur as a fuel source versus the sun. And it's able to produce some energy down there. And so it's the base of the food web and the food chain. So sometimes around hydrothermal vents, we'll see actually a significant amount of life for the bottom of the ocean. So it's pretty interesting. Okay. Our lakes and ponds. So this is something that you'll most likely see on the AP exam. Not so much on marine. I've never really seen so much marine on there. But for freshwater, you'll definitely see a question that's related to the zones of a lake. So, if you remember, we have our three main zones. We have the littoral, limnetic, and profundal zone. The littoral zone is right here. It's along the shoreline. There's little amounts of water in the littoral, so that's how we said that you can remember it. And here we really have cattails and emergent vegetation. So this is the area on the side of a lake where we do have some vegetation that's able to get out of the water, and it's going to expose itself to the air. We have the limnetic zone, which is the open part of the lake. So this is where we have most of our large fish that swim. And then the profundal zone, this is the deep, scary zone in a lake, the profundal zone. And this is a zone where there's no light that penetrates to the zone. And not every lake has it, because some lakes aren't deep enough. And it says here it's dominated by decomposers. So really all of the organic matter from the limnetic zone is going to fall down to the profundal zone. And bacteria are going to break it down, and it's actually going to have a decent amount of nutrients that are just sitting in the profundal zone. Just to remind you of your aquatic organisms as well, since it's not on here, but it's also good to know. Don't forget your three categories. We talked about we talked about plankton, and we said that plankton are free-floating organisms. We talked about nekton, and I told you that nekton were strong swimmers, so like fish. And then we talked about benthos. So benthos are organisms that live at the bottom. It could be of the ocean or of a lake, and it's at the bottom of it. So the benthic environment would be the bottom of the lake or the ocean. And again, just meaning like along the seafloor or the floor of the lake here. So that would be the benthic environment. Alrighty. Number 4, discuss problems with invasive species. So here's a definition. Plants and animals, it can be either one, that are non-native to an area or an ecosystem and can cause environmental or economic harm. So we've talked a lot, and in Florida, it's really easy to name invasive species that have accidentally been brought over here. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's on purpose. But the problem, the main issue, well, there's a few, but one of the main issues is that they're going to outcompete the native species. So when they're brought over to their new environment, they probably don't have a natural predator there, and so they're going to outcompete the native species. So we talked about the brown anole being invasive and how it's outcompeted the green anole. We've talked about other invasive species that have been brought over here, like the Burmese python, which was accidentally released. It's from southern Asia. We think that there are about 30,000 in Everglades National Park. And you've heard of these contests where you go out and you kill the largest pythons. Maybe you get money for it. Talked about the lionfish, another example. They're really hard to kill, and so they also have contests for that. So some of these were accidentally brought over here, and then some were purposely brought over here. Okay. Number 5. Super easy answer across the screen here. Major reason why animals become extinct or endangered. The number 1 reason is due to loss of habitat. So as we are needing more areas of land for us, we're removing habitats. And it could be for a variety of reasons, because we need more farmland, because we need more places for people to live. So due to human population, and don't forget that that's the number 1 centralized problem in environmental science is our growing population. Because we have so many people, we have to find more land to produce food and to live. And so because of that, we're removing habitats at alarming rates. And habitat loss is the number 1 reason why animals become endangered and possibly extinct. Oops, I think I'm out of order. Sorry. This one is for number 7, list characteristics of endangered species and some things humans can do to help. So we discussed this. These are actually characteristics of the organisms that make them more likely to become endangered and extinct. So we said organisms that have an extremely small range. I told you about the Mariposa lily, which is this flower right here. The Tiburon Mariposa lily, it's found really on one hilltop in San Francisco and California. And so if something were to happen to that hilltop, then they would go extinct. So an extremely small range. Requiring a large territory. Let's see if territory comes up. Nope, it doesn't. Large territory, so it's missing the word territory. But the California condor, which is this scavenger right here, it's a very ugly bird. It has a 10-foot wingspan. We said that it requires a large area to live and survive. It's such a large animal, and so as we remove its territory, it's more likely to become endangered. So the California condor. Number 3, living on islands. So any animal that's living on an island. The problem with that, if they're endemic to an area or an island, is that if something were to threaten them on that island, they have no place to escape to. Low reproductive success. We said the giant panda is pretty good for a lot of these. So organisms and animals that are unable to have offspring in a relatively short period of time, maybe they can only have 1 offspring or 2 one time a year, and they only have a few, so not having lots of offspring or taking a long time. So low reproductive success, kind of like the giant panda, we said that the female ovulates one time in the springtime for just a couple of days. And so that makes it difficult. If she's not impregnated at that time, then she has to wait a whole extra year for her to be impregnated again. So that, along with the fact that she only has 2 panda cubs, and in the wild she'll abandon one because she doesn't produce enough milk for both. And in the wild, we're luckily able to save one, but they only have 1 to 2, so it's not like they're having lots of offspring. Specialized breeding areas. So if there's an area where they are going to mate or lay their eggs, we talked about the Kemp's Ridley turtle. They lay their eggs on one beach, one area, on a beach in Mexico. So in that situation, it'd be difficult for them to reproduce if they have no beach. And specialized food. So again, the giant panda, 99% of its diet is bamboo. And if there were no bamboo left, obviously it wouldn't have any food. So these are some characteristics of species that make it more likely to become endangered. And let's see here. It says something that humans can do to help. So that was the second part of number 7. Really the best way to help these animals is in situ conservation. And we talked about in situ conservation recently, basically saving them in their natural habitat and saving habitats. Don't forget, ex situ means taking them out of their natural environment, putting them in like zoos and aquariums, and having them reproduce there. So in situ conservation and saving their habitats. Going back to number 6, describe LD50 and ED50. So here's your definition. The dose of a pollutant that kills half of the members of a tested, I should say population. Sorry for the spelling error. And LD stands for lethal dose, as you can see here, 50%. And something that we discuss is that the smaller the number, the more toxic the chemical, and the greater the number, the less toxic the chemical. And really, we come up with LD50s for many of our synthetic chemicals, including pesticides. We want to know how toxic they are. And it's done on test animals. I told you that's a really important thing. We would never practice LD50 or do a test like this on humans because that would be unethical. And actually, in recent times, we're kind of moving away from LD50, but it's still relevant. And you can see a dose response curve on the bottom right hand corner here. And this is something that we looked at. I told you need to understand where the LD50 was on a graph. And if you look at the response, if there were numbers here and it said 50%, that means that the response for 50% of the individuals that are being tested, you would go over to your line here and you would go down, and that would be your LD50. So the lower the LD50, the more toxic, the higher, the less toxic. We also talked about threshold, if you remember, and I had told you that threshold is the maximum amount of a substance that does not cause harm or death, so it doesn't kill anything. And so if we're looking at our line here, and I had to identify the threshold to be right about here. It's right on the point before this blue line lifts off of the x-axis. So that would be the threshold, the maximum dose that doesn't kill any species. And I said harm before. Don't forget ED50. ED50 we discussed, it's not lethal, so it's the effective dose. So that's what the E stands for. And so it could be harming, but anything that's sublethal. Our cycles. All right, let's go through our nitrogen cycle. I'm going to go to the original slide that I had showed you. All right, for the AP exam, you need to know the nitrogen cycle. Some years, it seems like the whole test is a nitrogen test. It has been found in every part, from the FRQs to the multiple choice. Some years, the kids come out and say, Mr. Stoll, oh my God, there was like no nitrogen on it, and I studied it so hard. So just something to be aware of. Like I said, the questions that you're not allowed to miss are questions that we have discussed and you should know. So you are not allowed to miss nitrogen cycle questions. This is just pure memorization, and if you had a hard time memorizing it in the beginning of the year, then go ahead and sit and memorize it now. So make note cards, draw pictures, whatever you have to do. But this is not a question that you're allowed to miss on the exam. So for the nitrogen cycle, we start with, and sorry, going out of order again, because that's for letter B. But we start with our first step, and it's a cycle, so I'm just going to start in this step. Doesn't mean that it starts here. It can start anywhere in the cycle. But we said that the atmosphere is made up of 78% nitrogen gas and 2 gas. So that's something that we know, the main gas in the atmosphere. And we need nitrogen. We need nitrogen inside of our bodies. It's really important for our DNA. Remember our 4 nitrogen bases. So we need nitrogen. And the nitrogen in the atmosphere, we can't just breathe it in and have it help with DNA or have it add to any of the biological molecules that we need. So we have to have a cycle that makes it get into us eventually and plants. So N2 gas is in the atmosphere. Our first step is nitrogen fixation. So biological nitrogen fixation is what we're going to focus on here. This is the first step where nitrogen gas is made into ammonia. We said rhizobium and cyanobacteria are able to fix nitrogen. And remember, we've talked about nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil. Maybe they live in and around the roots of legumes. So they're very beneficial because they're helping to put nitrogen into the soil, like alfalfa. All right, your next step, nitrification. Nitrification is when we have ammonia or ammonium ion that is going to be converted to nitrate. So I told you that this is a two-stepper. First goes to nitrite, then to nitrate. For this step, bacteria are going to run this step. Really run the whole cycle. But it goes to nitrites, then to nitrates. The reason why we need it in the form of nitrates is plants can use nitrates. They're unable to use nitrite. So NO3- is nitrate. Then from there we have a fork. It can either be taken up by plants or it can be put back into the atmosphere. So we're going to do the inner circling taken up by plants. Ooh. And that process, when the plant is going to take up that nitrate out of the soil and assimilate it into proteins, it's called assimilation. So we end up with these plant proteins. Again, it's incorporated into the DNA. And then when that plant or animal dies, or if the plant or animal, I don't know, urinates, puts the nitrogen somehow back into the soil, maybe decomposition, it's going to basically turn it back into ammonia. And this is also known as ammonification, this step. So ammonification is the same as decomposition. Nitrates are going to be put back into the atmosphere for the final step here. And that's denitrification. So nitrates through bacteria are going to be put back into the atmosphere. So this is your nitrogen cycle. Know it, love it. Make sure you're comfortable with it. All right, human activities on the nitrogen cycle. So some of the things that we're doing that are affecting the nitrogen cycle. Always think of cars and the burning of fuel. So the combustion of fossil fuels, especially gasoline in vehicles, cause acid deposition. So very similar to sulfur, we know that nitrogen oxides go up into the atmosphere. They're going to chemically combine with water, making nitric acid, and then we're going to have acid rain. By removing nitrogen from the topsoil, or just removing soil in general. And another big one, number 3, eutrophication. So nitrogen, specifically nitrates, can contribute to eutrophication. So don't forget that. We use nitrogen in our fertilizers because it helps plants grow. But then basically what happens is it runs off into our waterways, and then it causes algae to bloom. And that's our eutrophication, so don't forget that. right, moving on to our carbon cycle. What you need to know about the carbon cycle is that there's two major processes, and that includes photosynthesis and cell respiration. So you already knew that. So as animals and plants respire, we're going to put CO2 into the atmosphere. So we're adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. As we are breathing in and going through cell respiration, we're going to, as we breathe in and go through cell respiration, we're going to take oxygen out of the atmosphere. But photosynthesis, which plants do, is going to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So lots of trees and plants are known as carbon sinks. We talked about the ocean being the largest carbon sink. So respiration puts CO2 into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis takes it out of the atmosphere. Something that we're doing is we have been ripping up the fossil fuels from underneath the ground. So you can see at the bottom of this picture here, natural gas, coal, and oil. We have been removing these fossil fuels that have been stored there for millions of years, ripping them out of the ground, and we are burning them. So through combustion. And by taking that and burning them, we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So it's an example of an anthropogenic way in which we're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And as you know, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So number one, anthropogenic greenhouse gas. And here are human activities affecting burning fossil fuels, the clearing of trees and plants, so deforestation really. By removing all these trees, and especially burning them, we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere. Again, don't forget that trees are carbon sinks. Ocean's number one, but trees can absorb carbon. So they're known as carbon sinks. All right, your phosphorus cycle. You don't have to memorize any part of this. You should know what's going on, but you don't need to memorize all these lines. Not like the nitrogen cycle. All right, again, going out of order. Phosphorus cycle, biggest, most important thing you need to know, never enters the atmosphere as a gas. So this is the slowest cycle of them all, and it never enters the atmosphere as a gas. But you should know kind of what we use our phosphorus for. We do mine for phosphorus. I showed you an old phosphate mine in Florida. And they're important for humans because we have ATP, adenosine triphosphate, so we do need some phosphate for ourselves. And some of the activities, mining of rock, so we mine for phosphorus. We find it, we rip up the ground, and we surface mine for a lot of our phosphorus. So anything associated with mining. And then also eutrophication. So now we've said two cycles here that contribute to eutrophication. So don't forget nitrogen and phosphorus, those two, specifically nitrates and phosphates. Both of them are plant nutrients. We put them on our plants, our crops as fertilizer. It rains, it runs off into waterways, and then it causes algae to bloom. You know, from there, we have decomposers that break down that algae. They use up the oxygen, and they make the water hypoxic and anoxic, so lacking oxygen. Sulfur. Sulfur cycle, pretty simple, found in rocks. One of the main ways in which we affect this cycle, you should think of burning coal. But you can see here, we basically take sulfur, human-produced gases right here. We're releasing it by burning coal, going into the atmosphere. It's combining with oxygen and water, and we end up with sulfuric acid. So this is going to contribute to acid rain. Human activities, burning coal. You know, again, coal releases sulfur into the atmosphere, sulfur dioxide. It's going to combine chemically with water, rain down sulfuric acid. We also release sulfur from smelting of minerals. So we talked about the smelting process. But anytime we have rocks and we're heating them up, you can guess there's going to be some sulfur added to the atmosphere. And some natural sources of sulfur, just to remind you: volcanoes and weathering, so the weathering of rocks over time. The water cycle, or the hydrologic cycle, will be fancy. Hydrologic cycle. Make sure you know the steps of the hydrologic cycle. We can start anywhere, again, in the cycle. So we can start from evaporation or transpiration. So evaporation from soil, streams, rivers, and lakes, or the transpiration from vegetation. It's going to put water vapor into the atmosphere. And from there, we're going to have the formation of clouds or condensation, so cloud formation. After condensation, we're going to have precipitation. That could be in the form of rain, sleet, snow, or hail. And from there, depending on where it rains or this precipitation falls, we could have runoff. So we're going to have water go from an area of land running off into a body of water. We could have percolation or infiltration, so that water, instead of running off, is going to be absorbed by the ground and fill up our aquifers. And then evaporation. So again, it's going to lead to evaporation or transpiration if it's in the vegetation. If you look at this this picture here, notice that most of our water is located in the ocean. You probably could have guessed that. Nope. Human activities. We talked a lot about water quality, and we did our water quality lab. Human activities on the water cycle. We are overdrawing groundwater. So we talked about areas like the Ogallala Aquifer, where we've seen so much groundwater depleted. So they're using that water for irrigation. Number one freshwater use is irrigation. And in certain areas, we've seen the water table drop 1,000 feet or more. We talked about overdrawing water along coastlines. So we talked about a saltwater intrusion. So if we have a well along a coastline, that salt water starts to intrude on that well, and then we have to close it up and we can't use it anymore. And our harmful effects on water quality. So just think about, again, eutrophication, so from agriculture, like all the runoff. So really modifying or worsening our water quality. All right. Life history strategies. Yes. So we have our R and K selected. That's the purpose of this. It should be number 8, I believe. Just looking at my paper. All right. So life history strategies, R and K selected. These are reproductive strategies, and we have very cut and dry categories here, but really it's not so cut and dry. It's actually, a lot of organisms kind of have characteristics of each. But for this class and for you to memorize, I guess, and differentiate between them, you will keep them separate. So R selected, that lowercase r represents there's a high growth rate. A K selected species, we have this capital K here, representing that these organisms tend to stay around carrying capacity. So remember that a capital K is also carrying capacity. All right, so just to contrast these two, we have R selected. So this is going to be smaller organisms, insects, bacteria. They're going to be able to reproduce very often and have lots of offspring. And they really spend a lot of their energy in reproduction. They're able to reproduce at young ages. So when their offspring hatch, let's say insects, they're usually able to reproduce right away. They would have a high biotic potential, meaning that they're able to grow very quickly if there weren't restrictions. Our K selected, this would be like humans, elephants, large animals. We tend to have a slower growth rate, so we're not able to reproduce so quickly. It takes us maybe a couple of years to be able to reproduce and have offspring. We tend to be large. We have small broods, meaning we don't have many offspring every time we have children, so 1 to 2. And we really, our energy, instead of being spent in reproducing, is taking care of our offspring and making sure that they're able to make it to reproductive age. So we have R and K selected. All right. Again, out of order. I'm so no, we're not. 9. Differentiate between producers and consumers and trophic levels. So this is a simple food chain from your textbook. I just want to talk about this food chain. They've asked you guys to, they've asked students in the past to come up with a simple food web or a food chain on a practice FRQ or an FRQ before. Really important. It looks really simple. You're like, oh, I got this, but you got to make sure everything's right. So first of all, we know the energy comes from the sun. So if you're ever asked to draw a food web or a food chain, draw the sun. So you need to have a sun. We see here that the energy is going from the sun to the plant. So the arrows in our food web and food chain are going in one direction. They're not going the other way, or we don't have two-sided arrows. The arrows have to go from where the energy is coming from to the organism. So from the sun to the plant, from the plant to the mouse, from the mouse to the snake, from the snake to the bird, and then to the decomposer. So the arrows are going in the direction in which energy flows. We know, according to the laws of thermodynamics, that, and second law, that as energy is transferred from one thing to another, energy is lost as heat. And I even told you about 10% moves on and 90% is lost as heat. So here we have our heat dissipating. And here are trophic levels. So each level is called a trophic level. Here's our first trophic level. It's where we have our producers. These are organisms that are going through photosynthesis. They're using the sun's energy. Our second trophic level is going to be a primary consumer. They're going to be a herbivore. They're going to eat the grass. Our third level is our third trophic level is our secondary consumer. They're going to be a carnivore, maybe an omnivore. Our fourth trophic level is going to be our tertiary consumer. Again, omnivore or carnivore. And then we're going to have our decomposers here. And so this is a food chain. What else here? So you can see the difference here. Don't forget some vocab words like I just said, carnivore is meat eating, herbivore, plant eating, omnivore eats everything. We have an autotroph, which means that it's going to produce its own food. Heterotroph means that it's got to obtain that energy from someplace else, so it's got to eat. And also, we have a short food chain here. I just wanted to bring to your attention because there's such a loss of energy. So our food chains don't tend to be very long because there's a lot of dissipation of heat and energy from one level to another. All right. Relationship between ecosystems, number 10, habitats, communities, populations, and species. So if you guys remember, we looked at these pictures, I guess, in the first semester. A species is a group of organisms, just to remind you, it's not on here, group of organisms that are capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. So in this level of organization, species would come before population. So you'd have species, population. Population is the same species in an area. Here we have community, different species in an area at a particular time. So we have some eels and some shrimp, barracuda. We have our ecosystem. So ecosystems include the abiotic interaction. So you can see carbon dioxide here. It's being released. Excuse me. And then we went even further to talk about landscapes. So landscapes are areas that have several ecosystems. Biosphere is the whole Earth. It includes the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the lithosphere. And that's the end of your objectives. So I am going to make a separate video to go through Earth's major biomes for you to watch. But I know that this is a really long video and you're probably exhausted by this point. So you can watch the other video another time. See you soon.